All right, thank you all for coming today. We have a book presentation by Dr. Omar Sadr. Dr. Sadr got his PhD in 2018 from South Asian University. In 2020, he published Negotiating Cultural Diversity in Afghanistan, the book we will be talking about today, through Routledge Press. He's the founder of the Negotiating Ideas podcast, and previously held the position of Assistant Professor of Political Science at the American University of Afghanistan, and is now a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Governance and Markets. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Omar Sadr.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today. It's an honor to speak on some ideas that I would love to and I have written about. I will not discuss the entire book, but bits and pieces of how can we deal with the increasing contestation over cultural diversity in our societies. First of all, we know culture is important. Human beings are culturally embedded beings, not in the sense that their identity is contributed, but also culture is important for self-development of individuals. Culture provides meaning for so many of the choices that we make every day. It also provides a background for a certain form of solidarity that we bond in our societies. But what happens with growing diversification of our society, governments which deals with diversity increasingly have to adjust and readjust their policies. And culture in that sense, I think, is a site for both cohabitation, but also contestation. So the real dilemma here rests here in the fact that how can we coexist with each other, but also allow certain form of diversity and contestation. So in this book, Negotiating Cultural Diversity, I try to engage with certain political strands and political theory who deal with understanding of culture and cultural diversity. The first question is that in political theory, state is quite important. So the question is how state deals with cultural diversity. In a classic sense, and the classic nation state, the modern state which emerged in the 19th century, inherently has certain form of anxiety about diversity. It's not comfortable with cultural diversity. So at times it accepts it, but at times also it suppresses it. So, but here I want to see how this diversity is negotiated throughout the state construction. So the case, of course, is Afghanistan. I might not discuss the case which is between 1992 to 2001 with respect to Afghanistan, where a process of state building brought back the issue of identity and culture and this process of institutional building. But I will be keen here to discuss some general theoretical and philosophical ideas that how efforts and counter efforts towards establishing an accommodative, inclusive, pluralistic society will change. Some key findings, if I may just pause at the beginning, is that the modern centralized state in Afghanistan, of course, here, and one can generalize it in so many other societies also, has pursued an assimilationist policy, which has led to cultural discrimination in the country. But at the end, it failed to create a sense of integration, the process of national integration, which is required for integrity of a society. At the end of the day, failed with this policy. Second, the legacy of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, who is the founder of the modern state in Afghanistan, continued to influence the trajectory of state building, which happened in the 90s, but also in post-2001 in Afghanistan, and continued to end up the youth presence in the country. Third, while multiculturalism, I discussed that is in the West, it's about integration of immigrants into the mainstream society. In Afghanistan, that has not been the case. Actually, I will discuss that how multiculturalism itself is a Western idea. It emerged in Canada, in UK, and it's based on experiences in Australia and the United States. But in Afghanistan, it's a bit different. The urge for plurality has been a bottom-up process. to the extent that one can call this a kind of a social movement from below. And finally, the prospect for intercultural dialogue is quite challenging in a case like Afghanistan, as it's a fragile state, not a fragile society. And I will discuss about why intercultural dialogue is important in a society like Afghanistan. So now, the very first thing, how the idea of cultural diversity emerged. From a political standpoint, we are interested on the evolution of ideas. So the idea of cultural diversity emerged in the 18th century when certain romanticist scholars were countering Enlightenment theories and how industrialization, emphasis on rationality, somehow transforms society to the extent that it neglected the value of culture. German scholars of Romanticism, for example, Herder was one of the key philosophers who talked about how cultures are different, in a sense that values are different, but also incommensurable in the sense that we don't have a general framework to discuss and compare these cultures. To a certain extent, he puts a certain form of relativism, cultural relativism, that we don't have any overarching principles or ultimate values in society to judge these cultures. Later on, these ideas influenced two different conceptions of culture in the West, particularly in the United States. One can be called the anthropologist notion of culture, where anthropologists were interested to define culture in terms of all sorts of values, cultures, practices, norms, institutions, informal institutions, which might or may not be good, that a society may have. Those are all cultures. But beside the anthropologist notion, there was also a humanist notion of culture, which defined culture something as a high value. The best practices that the society has was considered culture. For example, the best poetry that we produce, the best song that we produce, the best sort of norms and constellations that a society may have, those are considered culture. So indeed, my point now here is that in both humanist and anthropologist notion of culture, you see culture has been defined in a plural manner. And there are multiple norms, values. But of course, these diversity of plurality were defined in a hierarchical manner. For example, in a humanist conception of chess and culture, cultures were divided between high culture and low culture. Those were the best product of the society, they were considered high culture. And of course, that comes from a certain form of historical and economic trajectory. On the other hand, anthropologists also somehow had a hierarchical notion of culture in the sense that they divided societies in an evolutionary trajectory where certain societies had been in an advanced stage of culture, but others were in a very primitive stage of culture. So you have cultures and then modern advanced societies culture. But when it comes to the question of how a state should deal with diversity, so of course, the very first huge philosophical idea which comes to my mind, to our mind, is of course liberalism. How liberals deal with cultural diversity. Liberals are quite interested in issues of diversity, but what's important for liberals is not necessarily cultural diversity. It's about norms and value diversity. How we should cherish individual autonomy and provide them certain framework and possibilities to pursue their own ends. And these ends that each individual pursues is of course different. So that means that liberals are interested in the issue of diversity of individual choices or norms, but not in terms of culture. And then liberals also has, liberals are not uniform in terms of how they encounter with cultural diversity. A certain branch of liberals are quite proceduralist in the sense that they emphasize on a common sort of procedures that the state should define. Not necessarily, the state should not define what is good life or the notion of good life, because by the time that a state defines the notion of good life, it endorses certain form of way of life, and that means your state is no more neutral. in an ontological sense. A state is taking a particular side. But on the other hand, you have civic assimilations within liberals. For example, John Rawls, who says that every society, in order to function properly, they do require to have a minimal set of consensus on some general framework or general principles, and that's what John Rawls called principle of justice. So Rawls do accept that every society has incommensurable notions of values and notions of good life, but instead of in order for societies to not become parochial when it comes to, for the state to become parochial when it comes to notions of good life, we have to, at the end of the day, should agree on a set of principles that, according to John Rawls, it is those values that classic liberal scholars like John Stuart Mill called it liberty. So, so he says how society will come to that agreement in terms of principle of justice. He proposes a certain form of procedure, and that is a freestanding concept of justice, which we reach through veil of ignorance. Veil of ignorance is a hypothetical scenario where all individuals in a society will be stripped out of their race, ethnicity, gender, and identity. And then they enter into a sort of dialogue with each other. That means that you don't have certain prejudices, which comes from your ascriptive identity and then come to a dialogue. And of course, if that sort of scenario is prepared, it is easy to reach to an agreement and come to a general consensus about freestanding notions of justice. So consensus is possible, basically. Now, there was an issue with, there was a problem with liberals' idea, particularly proceduralist or civic assimilationist. John Rawls himself confessed in a conversation with Alfred Stephen, another scholar who was critical of his ideas, that his theory was merely developed for advanced societies like the United States and the West, which has certain form of consensus over basic values of the society. The notion of liberty or equality was not much contested in 1960, post Second World War in the United States. So what happens is, if we endorse John Rawls' ideology, idea of coming to an agreement on free and standing notion of justice, what happens with people who are not just racist, but of course racists will not have any place in this equation, but even people who do not endorse liberal ideas like Marxists, or those who are quite traditionalist in terms of their religious attitude and belief, they are completely excluded from this equation. So that means John Rawls' theory did not consider those who did not endorse fundamental assumptions of liberalism. Anyway, so I will jump on now to the second branch of theories, which is called communitarians. Unlike liberals, which propose that individual autonomy is central and that should be recognized, these guys argue that human beings are cultural embedded in a sense that their identity is exclusively constituted by culture. Human being does not have any sense or meaning if you take them out of their culture. So culture is quite central in what and how we understand human beings. And here, for example, two scholars I can reference to. One is Michael Sandel of University of Harvard University, who talks about how community is important. And for Sandel, he defines community as a shared sense of meaning, which takes place around neighborhoods, family, churches, all these collectives which are below the state level or nation level. On the other hand, you have also scholars like Michael Walzer of Princeton University, who also emphasize on the issue of community and how collective is important. But for him, the idea of a sense of common goal or agreement around notion of good life can take place around the nation, and then the level of nation or the concept of nation itself as a community for Michel Walzer. Now, what should we do if culture and community is quite important for identity formation of individuals. According to communitarians, the sense that would be for a state to acknowledge and recognize this notion of good life, which comes from a certain level of community. So that means that the state will go and endorse group level rights and recognize cultural rights, certain practices which comes from a community as a form of their right to practice it. So that places communitarians in a different spectrum compared to that of the liberals. Canadian scholar Charles Taylor is a third example, a philosopher who defends communitarian idea, and he talks about how in 18th century the idea of individual emerged as an alternative notion. Earlier, before 18th century, of course, and societies were hierarchical in a sense that there was a notion of honor. The societies were divided based on honor in a hierarchical manner, but later on, as liberalism advanced, dignity was recognized, and dignity is distributed equally amongst human beings, and that provided a different conception of individual. And in this conception of individual, everyone has a sense of moral judgment. Every individual has the capacity of moral judgment to differentiate what's good and what's not good. But at the end of the day, what Charles Taylor says that, and he says that he acknowledges that, okay, we have to appreciate the politics of equality, which emerged out of Enlightenment. But beside politics of equality, we should also endorse an alternative idea, which is politics of difference. That means that recognition should not be only granted for equality, but also we should also understand that every individual and culture would be different from each other. And then he proposes as a result the idea of reverse discrimination. And that means that's something which is quite controversial now in the United States. Certain communities which were excluded earlier and social, political, or economic processes, so they were in a disadvantage compared to the rest or mainstream or majority communities. So that's why the state should apply certain form of reverse discrimination in order to uplift those who are in a marginalized status. Now, we understand how this idea has been problematic in a society like the United States, which everything is now revolving around certain form of essentialist notions of identity. Essentialist understanding of race, essentialist understanding of gender and sex, which has led to polarization of our societies. So that had certain problems, so that even now we can sense it. And finally, multiculturalists. Multiculturalists, some scholars argue that they are extension of communitarians, and they share so many things that communitarians claim. But at the same time, certain multicultural scholars differentiate themselves from communitarianism, and in the sense that they say, we do not highlight the importance of community and participation as communitarians does. What we highlight, we try to expand the idea of liberalism and try to bring liberalism in kind of agreement or reconciliation with the issue of minority rights. We do endorse that individuals have certain form of autonomy, and the sense of self-worth is quite important. But at the same time, certain liberal societies like Canada did appreciate the notion of diversity based on recognition of group rights. So that's why scholars like Kimlicka says that in this sense, political theory should meet the reality, what's going on in most of the liberal societies. Now, but still, one of the key pitfalls of multiculturalist understanding is also to equate or conflate cultural diversity with ethnic or racial categories. In a sense, when they talk about diversity, the cultural diversity, they refer to ethnic diversity or racial diversity. So that somehow reinforces a certain form of, a certain particular notion of group identity, which is discrete, internally homogeneous, but also bonded. So that also does not acknowledge how cultures are internally different. And there are certain form of diversity within each community, within each ethnic group or race that we may talk about. And moreover, multiculturalists consider differences as a permanent kind of scenario between different groups, which a kind of shift is not possible. Change and these kind of boundaries may not be possible. So that's why how to overcome this problem. I suggest that we can create a synthesis between ideas of liberalism, which is that we have to respect the idea that individuals have certain form of autonomy and they should have a choice, and that should be respected. The state or community should not interfere in that autonomy. But at the same time, I also think that cultural diversity is quite important. And now when we talk and conceptualize cultural diversity, we should differentiate it from ethnic or racial diversity. Cultures are not necessarily ethnic, should not be necessarily defined based on ethnic or racial categories. So, for example, scholars like Gulpreet Mahajan from India proposes the idea of critical multiculturalism, wherein she says that in the West, there's so much emphasis on protection of cultural diversity, which leads to that kind of scenario that I already explained. So she said, instead of that, we have to emphasize on principle of counter-homogenization. Well, that means that the state should take certain measures in order to prevent the homogenization of the society. But then how is that possible? To also encourage diversity along with autonomy. In order to do that, individual autonomy plus diversity, she proposes the idea of non-conformist membership. That means that individuals should be considered a member of their communities, but also they should be recognized to have the possibility of exit. They should have anytime if someone does not want to be in a certain community, they should have the possibility of dissent. That means non-conformist membership. So no more culture or groups should have the possibility of enforcing their norms or institutions forcefully on individuals. And then finally, when it comes to historical injustices, unlike communitarians or mainstream multiculturals, which propose group rights, these scholars propose spatial rights. That means that group rights is a very universal rubric, which applies to everyone in a nation. But here, spatial rights are exclusively given to particular marginalized community for a certain period of time. It will not be permanent. For example, what happens in the West, when you have a formative action, which deals with certain form of historical injustice, but there is no time frame for formative actions. How long this sort of policy should continue. And finally, in order to overcome the problem of defining cultural diversity in terms of disparate communities, we also have to encourage intercultural dialogue, meaning that individuals should learn from each other. Communities should also should have the possibility of exchanging norms, values, and certain form of products that they have with each other. So that's why intercultural dialogue is quite important. So what I do in the thesis is to apply the framework created here, a sentence between liberalism, intercultural dialogue, and critical multiculturalism, which balances between individual autonomy on one hand, cultural diversity on the other hand, and recognition for intercultural dialogue on the other hand. All of them coming together, that I think will address to a large extent the problematic of diversity and plurality that we have in our society. So I think I will stop here, and but I can discuss in details if you have any questions.
So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and raise your hand.
Could you briefly explain again the difference between multiculturalism and critical multiculturalism? Is it just the idea that multiculturalism by itself is prone to leading to identity politics, where the situations of critical multiculturalism is trying to acknowledge the fact that that can be multiculturalism and that governance structure can be to prevent that.
Yeah. So, for example, simply to say, on issues of diversity, we have two branches of ideas. The first one you can call it monoist, which emphasizes on uniformity of meanings, values, or even conceptions of culture. And then you have pluralists, extreme pluralists, which will argue that human beings are defined based on certain form of cultural practices, where that means that we don't have any overall ultimate value. So each culture will have their own certain conceptions of justice. Now, critical multiculturalists, for example, Bikku Porak says that there is a chance that we have to combine both of these perspectives together. Of course, human beings are natural; they have certain natural habits. That means that we have certain things which are in common. We are also embedded. That means we have certain things which are different from each other. That should allow us to have certain mechanism to have dialogue with each other. For example, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the set of values. How do you define it? Is it universal ultimate values that all nations from all corners of the globe should endorse it and accept it without any question or not? So he says that let's consider this as he proposes a principle which is called pluralist universalism. Pluralist universalism means that we have certain values which are universal, but what comes here is that every group, community, nations should have the possibility to internalize these universal values based on their own sort of practices, history, and culture. So that means we agree on a certain a minimal set of universal values, but those are not the same for everyone. For example, a Muslim society might slightly define freedom of association differently compared to a European society. So that's different compared to, for example, ideas of Western multiculturalism, like welcome liquor. How welcome liquor defines multiculturalism? He says societies should be categorized based on immigrants and indigenous people who have been historically living in Allah. So, for example, that's particularly reflecting the historical experiences of North American New World, exactly. And that kind of categorization, you don't have in Asia. Who is immigrant, who is indigenous, who is native, right? You can't do it in India, you can't do it in China. Everyone is, I mean, there has been continuous flow of people in these societies. Culture has been exchanged in Central Asia, let's say, for example, or in medieval Afghanistan for us. So that kind of categorization, Welcome Jacob suggests, it has a certain implication. When he says natives and immigrants, then he goes on to define different set of rights for each of these. Immigrants may have certain cultural rights, but may not have certain cultural rights, right? But indigenous will have a full-fledged enjoyment of all sorts of life and rights that a society recognizes. So that kind of categorization itself is quite problematic. First of all, we cannot generalize it. Secondly, where do you draw the boundaries between natives and immigrants? It's very problematic. Yeah.
Oh. In this framework, I mean, I'm just wondering what the political aspect is of political theory. And also, what's the theory? Like, is this about having like a hypothesis or, you know? So I guess just expanding on what's in this framework. I mean, it doesn't strike me as having a lot of role for politics.
Well, it is a normative political theory, so that's why you don't have that typical form of assumptions or hypothesis that you may have in a positivist political theory. So these are, I draw most of these theories are heavily drawing from normative philosophy, actually. Welcome Leka draws from, he is a political theorist, but he draws from philosophers, which are not necessarily political. That's number one. Second, if I got you correctly, so you're also asking what's political in this, right? Is that your question? What is political in here? Oh, well, so it depends on how we define politics. So for example, on our end, define politics as as we know in classic political theory, it emerged, the concept of politics emerged in polis. And polis, that meant a kind of non-violent interaction between citizens, individuals which are free. So violence and kind of forceful enforcement of things are pre-political. Rather, what we have, what is political? Political is persuasion, or political is dialogue. So that's one conception of politics. But traditionally, of course, political science define politics around institutions. And that institutions, one of the key institutions that political science is interested in is the state. Authority, sovereignty, power, whatever these central concepts that you define, these are all related to how the state functions and how the state has legitimacy. So here it is political because we talk about cultural diversity and relationship to the state. What the state should do with the diversity, what sort of policies it should design, whether it should endorse it, recognize it, or neglect it, or stay neutral, or be indifferent. So it's all about how a state should deal. So in that sense, in a classic sense, if we are talking about the state, that is political science. But my personal understanding about politics is something beyond the state. Like Foucault said, it's time to behead the king. Metaphorically means a political theory should go beyond the state. We political scientists are obsessed with the state, everything is around the state. But when it comes beyond the state, for example, something I recently spoke about it in a media, about nonviolent resistance against authoritarian regimes. Is there a possibility that people should come together in a sense to do a collective joint solidarity work to counter authoritarian state? If you go by a traditional understanding of politics, it may not be possible. But an alternative notion of politics that Foucault says, let's behead the king, or Arendt says that politics is about persuasion. Yes, nonviolent practices or resistance would be persuasion is about social interactions between all of us, and that is political itself. Yeah.
I think you say some really interesting things about culture and identity. And to me, and I'd love to hear if you agree, when you talk about multiculturalism, not necessarily the theory of it, just the act of, like there's different cultures in an environment. Most of those cultures are going to self-identify through some form of identity, whether it be ethnic or national or racial, or probably one. And so what I'm curious about is, of those that I listed in other identities like gender identity or what have you, professional identity, what types of first off, do you think of identity as kind of a multi-layered thing? And if you do, are there types of identity that you're specifically interested in looking at when trying to bring everything together?
Mm-hmm. First of all, yes, we have to understand identity as a multi-layered phenomenon. Unlike a traditional understanding in political science, where universal citizenship is the only identity that mainstream political society will recognize. Mm-hmm. You are a citizen. Mm-hmm. And we are not interested about what language you speak, which heritage you have come from, what sort of cuisine you cook, all of that. Right? The only thing which defines your relationship with the state is citizenship, nationhood is that. But of course, in a globalized world, the idea of political authority has transformed. You have multiple layers of political authority. And that requires us to redefine even the concept of citizenship based on multiple layers of authority which exist. So an individual can be cosmopolitan in one sense. They have certain sensibilities which are universal. They can also have certain sensibilities which are nationalistic. But at the same time, they may also have religious sentiments or certain sentiments which connects them to their neighborhood. So that's why I think some of the critical multiculturalists appreciate the fact that beyond universal citizenship, we also should allow individuals to have and enjoy different layers of identity that they have. Now, what I will differ from classic multiculturalists or communitarians is that I will say, let's also appreciate how both conformity, uniformity, and plurality has certain politics. The states do create homogenized policies, but in certain cases, the states also creates plurality. For example, the way census has been designed and in some Asian societies, that had further divided society in a segmented manner between different ethnic groups. For example, in the case of Afghanistan, now it's a universal knowledge that Afghanistan is multi-ethnic and that those are Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, Pashtuns. 100 years ago, these clusters and identities, as we know it today, didn't exist. How it came into being? To a large extent, because the state endorsed these very marginal or nominal identities and brought them into the state census and the way that it distributed, for example, national identities. Now it has been a conventional kind of wisdom that Afghanistan had these ethnic categories. Sensibilities and identity affiliations that Pashtun had, even the term Pashtun or the term Afghan or the other ways, it didn't exist in the modern sense that we have. So, well, of course, pre-modern societies defined there was a certain form of diversity, but they didn't require recognition for that diversity. As Charles Taylor says, that recognition comes with modernity, and that recognition comes with certain form of recognition and misrecognition sometimes. It comes in relationship with each other that we have. So if I say one last thing, we should appreciate that individuals has these categories, race, ethnicity, gender, but I think we should also allow, we should not consider them as discrete, and discrete in a way that bubbles which does not have possibility to interact with each other and share with each other. Culture, to a large extent, is also shared. It's not just between individuals, but between communities. We have shared cultures, like Nowruz in Central Asia. It doesn't have a common origin that which ethnic group owns Nowruz historically. It is shared between Persians and Turks. It's shared between Tajiks and Hazaras. And so culture is that, but also culture is contested. I think it depends on how a state deals with diversity. Politicization of culture, to a large extent, exacerbate the issue of the tensions which prevents a sort of peaceful coexistence. And if you recognize these cultures, there is extreme potential in our societies, in public sphere, through civil societies, that we appreciate this diversity, but also live with it together. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. Could you talk a little bit more about this synthesis step? Because I'm trying to think through what you're talking about. I think like multicultural has a really strong tension, either critical or just normal. Has a real tension with liberalism, that many cultures have norms, but they say individuals shouldn't do what they want always, right? So like culture by definition, not by definition, but often has some kind of rule set that infringes on pure liberalism. And you also mentioned how like the West has all differently than other places. So just like when you say synthesis between like this liberalism and like different cultures just coexisting, how do those things synthesize? Because there's a real tension there.
The tension exists if you exclude one from the other. The communitarians do not appreciate individual autonomy. The very first important ultimate value for them is community. Community has the authority to decide about good life, and the state should endorse that. That's not what liberal says. Liberal says individual has autonomy, and that comes from the dignity that you have, and that allows you to have certain choices. And state or community doesn't have authority to interfere on those, right? that you can define this to the extreme. Fukuyama, in the last book, he talks about price of liberalism in the US, and he says liberalism has been stretched both on its right and the left. It led to woke culture to the extent that everyone says this kind of toward the social injustices, the social injustices, you have to appreciate these identities, and there are X number of identities which has been created. But on the left also, it has not addressed the term neoliberal, which is also problematic for certain economists. It has also delegalized certain societies to a large extent, which has led to this crisis. So that means that if individual is at the center of our analysis, what do you do with culture, with groups, right? So can we bring these together? Is there a possibility to reconcile? And the answer is yes. How to transform it? Culture is important, but do not conflate culture with certain ascriptive, predefined, fixed identities. And then at the same time, allow people to have non-conformist membership into any culture that they want. So you appreciate culture, but at the same time appreciate individual autonomy to be member or not be member. So I give one example in the book about, I have 3 cases to maybe one I should discuss this because there were a couple of questions on this. So on politics of intercultural dialogue, so how do you reconcile individual rights with group rights? So if I get the second case that I have, women rights, Shia personal law in Afghanistan. So if multicultural policies require the state to recognize groups and how the way of life that they have, that means Shia minority in Afghanistan who define themselves as a disparate category based on religious identity will have a right to have their own laws recognized, right? So the state went on in Afghanistan in 2009, allowed religious community of Shia clerks to draft a law, Shia personal law. The law was drafted by some clerks. It went to parliament and the parliament ratified it. At the end of the day, when it was brought to the public, there was severe violations of women. Woman should take permission of husband when she goes out of the house. Let's say what happens now in the problem. To a large extent, that's what it is. So that created a tension. Civil society, intellectuals, those who were concerned with liberalism and women's rights, they criticized the law. But on the other hand, you had this conservative clergy and people who wanted to have this law. This happened, the dialogue happened through a kind of very contentious manner. There were several demonstrations on both sides. Finally, what happened, President assigned a committee to review the law. And the committee consists of both groups. The liberals who were concerned with individual women's rights and those who were concerned with religious communities' practices. The committee, after dialogue with each other, they came with a new draft, where they appreciated to a large extent women's rights, removed all those controversial rights, but at the same time affirmed the right of community to have their law. So the law was redrafted and then ratified by the president. So that's a good example of how you appreciate community practices. Otherwise, a secular state in extreme manner with practice in France, not in the US. For example, in US secularism, the very first character of secularism in the US is recognition of religious practices. That's not the case in France. So here, the state appreciated community identity, community customs, endorsed it, but also made sure that certain universal values should not be violated. But what happened here? The third case, patrimony and violation of human rights. I studied a case of one guy called Adel who came from southern province, Paktiar. This guy protested against his family first, because his family made his sister forcefully married and to another family because they killed someone from another tribe. So the girl was forcefully given to another tribe because this is a tribal custom in order to remove that guilt. This guy protested against this practice. The family kicks him out. Then he goes into the community. He reaches out to the other community members in his own village. The community also kicks him out. He goes to the provincial level, tries to speak with governor to say that we have to reform these practices. They also kick him out and they label him, he's a madman. He finally comes to Kabul and protests in front of Parliament, asking religious ulamas, plus Parliament, plus President, civil society, to address this crisis, to prevent this tribal code, which is called Pashtunwali. A debate, a momentum happened in Kabul. Several civil society institutions who went and visited him have had a dialogue, but nothing happened at the state level. The state didn't take any kind of measures to ensure universal values, which violated his sister's right. She should have a choice with respect to marriage. So there is also a failed case, which shows that an individual who comes from the same culture protests against his own culture, but the state fails to protect and take an action in this case. And then I have the very first case, which is something similar to Salman Rushdie's controversy. So most of you know about Rushdie affairs, what happened. We had a minimal case of the same thing in Afghanistan. Here, Taqi Bakhtiyari, this guy wrote a novel in Farsi. The novel was written about a mullah, a religious clerk, who rapes a toddler, probably in a religious madrasa, in a mosque. So that's the brief what happened, but that's complicated, the novel. When it comes to novels called Gumnami, when it was released, religious community accused this guy as a blasphemy, and the novel as blasphemy. They burned the book and didn't allow republication of it. And again, the state didn't have a choice didn't have authority to intervene and prevent it. For the very first case, which Abdurrahman, who is a guy, he was accused of converting to Christianity. Again, a deeply religious society, where religious sentiments are quite stronger compared to that of state authority and universal values. So in that case also there's a failure. So that's why I argue here as a conclusion that in a fragile society like Afghanistan, that you have a weak state, it's quite difficult to have intercultural dialogue. Intercultural dialogue requires certain form of principles, which includes respect, which includes openness. People and community should come together, and also it also requires certain form of willingness. You have me and you, we will engage in a dialogue. If I don't have that willingness to engage in a dialogue with you, and dialogue may not happen. And now that's what we deal with the Taliban. Everyone wants to talk with the Taliban, but they do not talk to us. So you cannot push this agenda. There are certain limitations also to intercultural dialogue. If you don't have that prerequisites, it may not take place. Yes. Yes, please.
I mean, this is really, but I mean, with like Pashtun law, right? I mean, I would not necessarily think about because there's essentially an enforcement mechanism. It's very formalized. It's maybe not always part of the state. But the general point would be, in one sense, it's Pashtunwali part of culture. I mean, it strikes me as like you're basically saying there's stuff that comes from the state or legal relationship, and if it's not that, then it's culture. But I tend to think about culture as something more like, do you trust strangers? Right?
Do you trust?
Do you trust strangers?
Yeah.
Right? You know, do you think that if you work hard, you're gonna get rewarded? I see that as culture.
Okay.
Something that's much more kind of like almost decentralized.
Exactly.
You know, so but I just wanted to ask. Like,
No, I totally agree with you.
Why is it cultural?
And so, in principle, I agree with you. The two examples that you give about trust, it's all about norms. But these norms are informal. And what you in institutional economics called it informal institutions. But where they locate? Based on, for example, one scholar in George Mason University, Chris Coyne, he talks about how social norms are important, but these social norms are coming, according to him, from certain knowledge and historical practices that you have. He uses a term from Greek called myth, M-E-T-I. How do you pronounce this? Mythos.
Yeah.
And that mythos is a kind of lived experiences which comes from your historical background. So these are not officially recognized by the state, but they do exist as a web, as a fabric within the communities and societies. And culture is exactly that. The culture is norms, informal institutions, practices, embedded knowledge at certain form of the scales that we all have as individual and community. Now, Pashtunwali is a form of culture. It has certain code of conduct, which is not formal, but informally has controls and governs communities and societies. And the way, for example, two neighbors will exchange and interact with each other, that there are certain codes which regulates this. Do we consider these codes as norms? I think so. These are norms which regulates these behaviors, and that's what's culture. So culture is customs, all sorts of soft, beautiful things that you think, but also invisible issues like norms, which are, I mean, it exists, but no one enforces it.
This is the governing key differences thing I'll say. I see your point, but I disagree. Simply because I think Pashtunwali is a law.
Okay.
And there are multiple laws in Afghanistan. And I'm not sure that calling it culture adds something to that, because even the formal laws that come from the state are shaped by culture.
Okay.
In a similar way as Pashtunwali.
All
But I like the point.
right. No, I also appreciate your point. Now, it should be a law, but we call it customs. From a legal perspective, we have two types of laws. Even in Islamic perspective, we have two types of laws. Laws which are formal, written, codified, ratified, informal, which are called customs.
Right.
We call informal laws customs, and customs are culture. Yes, please.
It kind of maybe building on Doria's point a little bit. Like in this question about like how does the state manage culture generally or manage societal cultural issues, I can think of a lot of different types of strategies they can use. You know, one, they can focus on like changing laws or something like that. Two, they can focus on, you know, if someone within a community is struggling and they want to leave, they could, you know, their policy could be about, you know, trying to get people to go into that community and remove those people safely. They could also use other strategies about, you know, engaging other community leaders to come and help. I feel like there's a lot of different kinds of state action that are possible that, you know, it kind of blurs the line a little bit between, is this really state action, or is this kind of, you know, is this kind of a blend of state and, you know, informal understandings that get developed over time, and maybe the state guiding those, you know, developments. So yeah, that might be another interesting thing to think about, is like, you know, how the state can actually intervene and like the different intensities in which they can do so. I think that's a short.
Of course, I think another philosopher, Tarek Moudud, who is a British pluralist, he says that we have two types of pluralism, soft and hard. Hard is recognition of practices into the law. Soft pluralism or multiculturalism, you may say, is appreciating diversity through dialogue, interaction. And that may take any multiple forms that you may want. So here, for example, if we talk about language of rights and recognition, so you may have political rights, which may include devising a decentralized political system, which allows multiple practices, including the ones which are coming from bottom up. And then you may also recognize certain spatial rights for those very, very minorities that we have. For example, in Canada, Indigenous communities, do they have possibility to have education in their own language? To what extent in terms of, let's say, is it just or is it possible to have that? Because states should spend lots of resources, which is not necessarily from the same small community, in order to print, let's say, educational material for them. That's spatial rights. And then in terms of cultural rights, you have symbolic claims. That's quite important in Asian societies like Afghanistan, that every community wants to be appreciated in flag, for example, or in the name of the state, let's say, or a national anthem, for example. These are all symbolic kind of practices.
I think that typology is really interesting, the typology of state interventions, the different kinds, breaking them down. I think that's,
Yeah.
that's an interesting part of the model.
Yeah. So I will come to you, and then do we have time? Or?
I think we're actually running, maybe one more. Let's do one more question.
Okay, yes, please.
So with collective rights, the cases I'm most familiar with are India and Canada. I realize both similar and different to Afghanistan in some ways. But I wanted to ask, if we are forming codes of law that pertain to certain groups, or forming institutions that pertain to certain groups, especially in very what we call new nations like Canada or India, where it's very diverse. At what point are we, is a state or a nation state, delegitimizing itself by creating kind of subcodes, subnational codes of law? Because we're seeing in some of these places, like in Canada, for example, very heavy separatism. Quebec, Nunavut, and the western provinces. India is very, very rapid political violence between the Hindu nationalist population, Muslim population. And it seems to be a very big dividing force. I don't subscribe to the idea that it might legitimize the nation, but I wanted to ask you what your perspective.
So can you elaborate on Indian case? How do you say that one? That is do you say Indian as an example?
Yeah, I mean, like with the Shabana case.
Uh-huh.
Just led to very heavy division, and also the Sikh population in Punjab as well has been very heavy division with that. It's a much smaller population than the Muslim population, but this idea of secularism in India as giving individual groups kind of governing power over their populations, even if the cultural differences are higher than the religious differences, because you have people, Hindus and Muslims, who are very culturally similar in very small villages. The one difference is their official religion, and that difference tends to be the one that we hone in on. Especially if you're an outside looking in, if you were, that's what the British essentially did. That's how early knowledge like Al-Biruni, would kind of gauge the may have gauged India at one point. But I was just curious if these kind of collective rights may delegitimize kind of the basis of the existence of a nation state. Of this, we govern this territory, these people for this reason.
Yeah, I will say a couple of things. First of all, I didn't defend the idea of collective rights. Because that comes from an essentialist understanding of community and group.
I didn't think you were.
But I will say that does states strengthen themselves if they impose a universal principle from above, or states will receive much more strength if they allow communities to come together and then provide certain provisions, and then state aligns itself with those provisions or customs or laws which comes from within. I think the second one, the state which allows communities, particularly in contexts like Afghanistan, where institutional capacity of state is quite weak. State doesn't have law and order, rule of law, and police force to enforce everything. So why don't you allow people to come up with their rules and then you facilitate them, right? Now, in terms of India and Quebec, again, I am not in favor of extreme separatism, which is in Canada, let's say. But also what happens in India, I think the case of the current crisis of India is not because of pluralism or diversity. It's because of the right-wing policies of the state, which redefines secularism. The opening of New Temple, which happened last week. Consider two examples. Historically, Nehru rebuilt Somanath, which was destroyed by Ghaznavid Empire from Khorasan. But Nehru didn't attend official ceremony of opening that temple because he thought by doing that, he endorses the states endorsing a particular religion, which is Hinduism. He allowed the temple to be rebuilt, but as a prime minister, he didn't go to it. And instead, the president, which was quite nominal position, he went. Now Narendra Modi is doing another way. He says Ram is our philosophy, he's our science, he's our identity. Ram is an Hindu figure. So he redefines the state identity based on a religion, right? That of course creates tension, and that's against certain provisions earlier court in the 90s had different kind of ruling, right? It granted the land to the state or Hindu community, but also in exchange it provided land to the Muslims. How do you prevent tension? Was it necessary to build that historical whatever temple and a contentious place? Of course, it creates tensions. So I think Indian secularism was quite a good successful model, at least before BGP. Many praised Indian secularism because Indian secularism recognized all religions, not one religion, but all religions in public sphere, without endorsing one of them, singling out. But now it's moving the other way around. It's a kind of Taliban version of India, that you have one religion coming and dominating. I hope I understood.
Excellent, and I do, based on my work, I do agree with that assessment. You encounter a lot of centers, on the kind of nationalist wing who are very critical of BJP, INC kind of governed India secularist policies of that era, or the, kind of the falls of the various prime ministers of that era. But yeah, thank you very much for answering the question. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Anyway, thank you so much. I think we are over time now.
Thank you.